Good morning, everyone. It's great that you survived last night's dinner. If we get a first slide, we can start. So here is a picture of the dunes in the Netherlands. This is an absolutely gorgeous area. Actually, I'm living quite close to this, and you see this. It's this in-between thing between the sea, where you have all these waves going on, and then you have the buzzes of the city behind you, and then in between there's this quietness and this lovely thing where life is happening, with the birds and the water and the trees and the whole lot. And over the past many hundred years or many thousand years, people have been thinking about this and thinking about trying to understand, trying to make sense of life as it is. And after I would say the last 300 years, 350 years, the perspective of this changed a little bit. And on the next slide, we have a picture of that. Yeah. So this is another way to look at the same thing. This is where we have, all these different beautiful results of science over the last 350 years, all the way from the gravitation equations, or from the field equations of Einstein, the Schrödinger equation over here describing the smallest of the smallest, the Navier-Stokes equation, what's happening with the cosmic radiation, and all these bits and pieces have been discovered. These are icons, if you like, of icons of the science of the past 350 years. A totally amazing amount of results. And a totally spectacular way of having a better understanding of how bits and pieces in the world come about, and how we can try to describe them in different ways. But the question you might ask yourself is, okay, yes, we might know how these different bits and pieces work, but how do they work together, and do they work together? And can we understand the combined structure, if you like, of these things, rather than the elements of it themselves? So, and that is a question that's always been, particularly the philosophers have been thinking about this. And on the next slide, you will see a star, but that's not what I'm looking for. There it is. So you'll see one of the philosophers, one of the Chinese philosophers, Lao Tse. And Lao Tse said, well, if we try to understand how these things all go together, we have to look at the bigger picture rather than just only at the elements. And he said, okay, look at the tree, a mountain, or the foam on the water when it hits the shoreline, and all amazingly beautiful, in all kinds of wild and crazy patterns. All of it has an order to it that we simply cannot measure or describe. This is Li, the organic pattern. And Tao is the way to create patterns in chaos. So we talk about 650 years BC, where these philosophers, the Chinese philosophers, trying to make sense of the world around them. And those patterns that are emerging from those underlying processes that we were just talking about, people have been thinking about this forever. And here's another quote by one of, I guess, the hero of most of us, by Richard Feynman, saying that nature uses nature uses only the longest threads to weave her patterns. So each small piece of her fabric reveals the organization of the entire tapestry. Beautiful way of expressing that underneath things, underneath our observations, there's something that connects things together. And the question is, what is it that connects things together? And of course, the astronomers will say that's gravitation, but there are different ways of looking at it. So, and here are some beautiful patterns to give you a flavor of it. If we go to the next slide, then the question, that was the right one. It's gone now. There it is. So we do see these patterns, and the question we can ask ourselves, what are these patterns doing? Are they doing anything? And so if we think about the neurons firing in our brains, creating thoughts, so to say, you can ask yourself, okay, how many of those neurons actually create a thought? Or, put it in verse, how much of a thought is still present in one neuron? Well, obviously not much there. So, okay, how much of a thought is present in 10 neurons, or 1,000, or 10,000, or a billion neurons? And where do we cross that border? And do we cross the border, and do we understand that? So what are these patterns doing? And obviously they have a purpose, but we don't know. Well, we are looking for what would be that purpose. And the thing is that these patterns, they don't only just register what's going on underneath it, so to say, in the lower levels, but they also have kind of emerging properties on the higher levels. And the thing is, if you look on the next slide, that if we think about this very funny experiment that people did in the 50s, where they found out that the majority of the molecules in the atoms in your body are actually replaced every year. So about 96% of every molecule in your body is replaced every year. Yet still, every morning when you look into the mirror, you're almost the same like you were the night before, right? So somehow there is a memory in the system, because of the structure of the system, that those molecules end up in the same in the right place again. So it seems that these molecules, that there is a pattern somehow that stores where they go and what they should do. So about every year, 96% of the molecules in your body are replaced. So it might be, this is just of course a flavor, it might be that the thing that's actually storing that information is what we are looking for. The thing that is storing how you are constructed, so to say, is what we're actually looking for. So on the next slide, there is a suggestion of what those structures might be. Now, there's different ways of looking at this, and I just want to give you one way to look at it. So here you see three different examples of what we call complex networks. Three different examples, all the way from these are protein-protein interactions. So this results from work. This is how the virus, HIV virus, is in interaction with the immune system. So this is on a molecular level, if you like, how those networks come about. We find them, quite abundant in nature. This is a network of criminals collaborating together, creating. So here in this molecular network, it's actually stabilizing the HIV virus, and here it's a process that's stabilizing a criminal activity, which in particular case is the production of cannabis. And here is a sexual network, which is a transmission network. Actually, partly this is the heterosexual transmission network of the United States. And so you see on three different levels, from the molecular level all the way up to the individual social level, structure level, we find those networks as structures in which we can represent what's going on and how information is being shared and transferred, but also stored. So let's have a bit of a deeper look at those networks, just to give a flavor of things. So on the next slide, we'll have a little animation of that. And so what we do now here, this is a Mickey Mouse thing. It's a bit of hand waving, but it gives you the flavor of how these things will go about. So what we do is we just start throwing, if you like, balls at the screen here. And every time we throw a ball, we try to connect it to another ball. But we try, there's a high preference to connect it to the ones that already have many connections. So you have, if you like, the kind of Prometheus effect, right? So the rich get richer. The guys with many funding from the National Science Foundation get more funding from the National Science Foundation, as we have seen in the NRC recently. And you see, you just throw more balls at it, and then you connect them in such a way that you get this network. So the size of these balls indicate how many connections go in and out of that ball. And that way, with this kind of preferential attachment, this is a result from the last 15 years, we can reconstruct those networks that I was talking to you about. So these molecular networks all the way up to the social networks. Now in this slide, there's another way to look at it. So you say, okay, if somehow these networks are a representation of how these things get connected, then we can ask ourselves the question, so what's happening in those networks? It's not just the fact that these things have a topological structure, and that topological structure, of course, can change over time, which might be a function of what it's actually doing. But there is also that within those networks, there are signals going on. And like easily, you know, in the genetic network or in protein network, it's clear that we have this up-regulating, down-regulating signals. In a social network, these could be messages. So what we want to look at is, okay, can we describe those signals as the way information is being propagated through those networks? So there is something happening somewhere on one of those nodes, and can we calculate the probability of how information is propagating to that network, and how would that contribute to the function of the network? So that's what we started to look into. And then you realized a couple of things. One is, if you have a network, I just created the same network again. And if you have a network, you would take out randomly the nodes, so these balls. So you take them out randomly. So you just pick one and you just take it out, and then the wires get loose. And you do that for some time on these complex networks. They have a very particular topological mathematical structure, which I won't go into. But if you do that, then after some time, you actually see that the whole network stays very coherent. I can still get information all the way from here through this system all the way up there. There's one disconnected here, but for the further bar, I can just, you know, still get information along. So that means that those networks with these particular characteristics, this Prometheus characteristic, this preferential attachment characteristic, they are very resilient with respect to random disturbances. So you can randomly kick at it, and still it somehow keeps its coherence and its possibility to transfer information. Now, if you do the same network, but now you have a targeted attack. So now what you do is you actually kick the big balls, so to say, the ones with the highest connections. So every time you see a flash, we kick out one which has the highest connection at that point in time. And then already, after a very short time here, you have all these little islands, and there's no way I can get information anymore across the whole system. So these are two very particular, and I think also pretty important aspects of those networks. So the first one basically says, if you do a random attack, I can still maintain the coherency in the network, and I can still transfer information across it. The second one says, if I disrupt it in a targeted way, like this one, I actually disrupt the whole network, and there's no way I can get information across anymore. So this resilience with respect to random noise is a very important characteristic, which might be one of the reasons why nature wants to store its information in those networks. Now on the next slide, okay, this is just a thing that what we started to do when we started looking to these complex networks. We say, okay, we need to come up with different ways to measure how that information is growing through these networks, and we use things like feature information and mutual information characteristics for that. But that's a detail that's not so important. What is important is that we try to describe the dynamics by the way information propagates through it, and which is pretty hard to do because you get all these synergetic effects. You don't know, it's very hard to define. If you look at one piece of the node, it's very hard to define how much of the information comes from what part of the network. So there are some tricks that we worked out to do with. And that's shown on the next slide, the results of that. Let me see what we get here. So this is an animation of the same network. But now what we do, we put on each node, we put a thing like icing, we make it an icing spin kind of thing. So we put on each node a little magnet, right? And then we say, what would happen if we would flip that magnet, if we would flip it from north to south? And what you just saw is that this was one of the peripheral nodes. So these are the nodes that have very few connections. And just flipping it, not much happened. And here, what we're doing now, here we are looking at this node up here. And that's kind of in between. It's not highly connected. It's not remotely connected. But it has a lot of effect. By flipping it, you see that propagating through the whole network. And then we look at the really high connected ones. So these are the richer of the richest, so to say. And it's really very hard to flip that node. It's very hard to change, any informational change that you do to that node is very hard because it's stabilized by the whole network. And this concept that the peripheral nodes are, if you change something, actually doesn't really matter much. The very much connected nodes also doesn't matter so much. It's actually the man in the street that really matters a lot. And here's so here's again the idea. What we did, we put these Ising spins on it, and then we calculated all this information transfer through it. And then you get this very funny thing that we didn't expect. So here you have the degree, and degree meaning the amount of links going out of one of those nodes, right? So here you have, these are the highly connected nodes, so to say, and these are the very lowly connected nodes. And this is the amount of information that's been dissipated through the system, measured by this feature information I was talking about. So what I would have expected, that if you have highly connected nodes, I would have expected that the highly connected nodes are the ones actually describing the dynamics in the network. So I would expect that the information dissipation was, the largest here and the smallest here. But what you actually see, it's actually going through this optimum somewhere in between, this man in the street idea again. And that was shown in the previous animation, where you saw that, fiddling around with the peripheral nodes doesn't matter so much. Fiddling around with the high connected nodes doesn't matter so much, because all the information in that node is already stored in the system, and even taking it out doesn't matter so much for the dynamics. And so that's kind of a remarkable thing. And then we went back to literature, and if you see it's shown over here, and we found for many cases, and I just show 3 of them, that this is actually happening in nature also. So this is a network of neurons where we have recast that graph in terms of the information dissipation. And again, you see this kind of strange behavior happening here. Well, it's actually better shown here. And it's again here basically the connectivity against the way information is propagated through the neural system. And this is a social network where, with not too much fantasy, you can see still the same kind of structure here: low connection, high connection. And this is the dissipation of information in such a social network. This was word of mouth marketing from Amazon.com. And here is for gene regulatory network that was published in 2007. And again, if you look at the connectivity of the regulatory network, it seems that the information dissipation is maximum somewhere in the middle, which for me is very counterintuitive. I would really expect that people like Oprah Winfrey matter much more than people somewhere here in the middle, but that's not true. If you took it from a network information dissipation point of view, that's not true, which is kind of an interesting observation. It also, again, comes back to the observation, why would nature, if you like, invent networks? Well, again, maybe because this resilience to changes of these peripheral nodes and the independence of these big hub nodes and the sensitivity that's kind of lying in between. So you can think of it like, this famous order to disorder transition, where the complexity happens in the man in the street part. So if we go to the next slide, there's another observation, and which I think is interesting to share with you, is a thing that we discovered when we try to understand, again, this information propagation through the network in terms of noise, of various types of noise. So here we looked at the 2 different types of noise. One is where we do random rewiring of the nodes, and the other one is in which we randomly just take out hubs. And so what we then observe is a thing which is very much like a well-known thing in physics, which is stochastic resonance. So you can think of, if you have a signal here and like the blue signal here, and you just superimpose on that some kind of node, and every now and then you come across some threshold that you would never come across before. That's one way at looking at what we call the stochastic resonance. Another way to look at it is that you say, okay, the system can be in 2 states, and it just sits there in this energy minimum. But then by adding noise to it, which is actually hobbling around with this minimal state, there is a probability that it can move from one to another. And so what we observed is that these are the different types of noise, that the way you get information through the system, like from here all the way to there, as a function of the noise, actually it gets better. So a little bit of noise will actually make it more efficient in terms of the amount of energy that you need, or the amount of time that you need to propagate that signal. It makes it better if you add a little bit of noise and then it goes down again. So a little bit of noise adding to that system makes it easier possible to get from one to the other side. Now that's easily to understand if you think of it like this energy landscape, but then think of it like many-dimensional. Because basically what you do, you try to find the shortest path through that network, but then just kicking it with a little bit of noise, you might just discover new paths that you never came across before. So it's like a better way to explore your phase space. Now for me, these observations, so the previous slide that I showed and this one, these observations give me kind of a, might give you a feeling that those networks are not there for nothing. They are there because they have a stabilizing effect, because they can store information, because they have macroscopic properties that we can build on from macroscopic that we can build up from microscopic interactions, and they somehow seem to be very resilient with respect to different types of noise. And that could be the reason why, over so many billion years that we have, that nature kind of thought, okay, maybe I should store my information in such structures. So if we look at the next slide, so that basically the way to look at it is to say, okay, if nature stores this information in those networks, then where does it come from? Well, the only place that information can come from is basically from the sun. And as you know, there is this very famous relation that says, okay, that couples the Gibbs free energy to the entropy, which is a way of measuring information in the system. And so you could argue that instead of giving free energy putting free energy into the biosphere, we actually, what we do, we put information into the biosphere, which is then stored in those structures. And of course, that has been the field of thermodynamics that started with the beautiful experiments of Carnot and Clausius on the steam engine, all the way to 1900s, where we had Claude Shannon describing that in information theory. So we go from thermodynamics to starting particle descriptions in the statistical mechanics from Boltzmann, etc., ending up in, if you like, a more abstract description of those things, not in terms of waves, not in terms of particles, but in terms of information. And there is this equation that connects these things together, with, of course, the second law of thermodynamics saying that in the end everything will be chaos. So if we move to the next slide, then when we started to discuss this, the thought of information as being a way to describe what nature is doing, how it processes, and how it actually calculates its own evolution, if you like. Of course, the question you have to answer is, how does quantum mechanics fit into this? Now, this is way more complex to capture in a few slides. So this is work that we've done with Mila Gu, who is located also in the lab in Singapore, in NTU, in the Complexity Institute, and he's working on trying to describe the information efficiency that you can get out of quantum information. Now, without going into details, the bottom line that he found was, and I just read it out here, so the classical result is, and as a result is very well established by people like Jim Crutchfield, that we have to store more information about the cause, which is denoted by C mu, than the cause actually contains about the effect that we're measuring, if you like. So you have to store more information about the cause than the cause actually, in the end, contains about the effect. And Mila actually showed that if we look in a quantum machine, that the quantum machine stores much less information in order to reproduce the effect. And that can be really significant amounts. So this is a very foundational result, I think, that when he came with that in 2012, it took like 4 years from a group in Australia to reproduce that in a quantum optical machine, and I managed to actually get the one-to-one correlation with what he found from this theoretical observation. So this seems to be true. So what is the message of that? So the message is again that we might use information as a very foundational way to describe nature around us, and it actually might even hold for quantum processes. Now, I cannot explain much about it at this point in time, but this is the bottom line why you would say, okay, that is again maybe a good way to look at these things. So that allows us for the next slide, I think, where we actually say, okay, well, if this, I've been doing hand waving mostly now, but well, let's do a leap of faith now. Let's say, okay, maybe a way to describe nature is just describe it totally in terms of information, whether it's quantum, whether it's classical information, doesn't really matter so much. So let's say instead of describing it in terms of mass, energy, and matter, maybe we should start to look at these things in terms of storage, registration, transformation, and transition, if you like, of information. And so that's basically the message. If you look at the next slide, then I thought it was just a funny thing to show you. This is, I thought I'm in the dome, so I might as well use it. So this is the way I like to think about it, that the sun not just gives us Gibbs free energy, but it actually gives us information. And that information is stored in those networks that I was talking about. Because of the reasons that I was showing you, they are resilient to noise, and they have these stabilizing factors in there. And they allow the system to escape for a certain period of time from dissipating into chaos by creating those dissipative structures. And so if we go to the next slide. So the message that I want to bring across, and which I want to finish, which is the following one, that says that life, as we observe it, arises from the transformation of Gibbs free energy into structures that use networks as an abstractions to register, share, and process information. And all the while, life is computing its own future, because by evolution of that information through those networks, it actually recalculates its next state. And then, of course, you can ask yourself the question, so what's the point of it? Why is life doing that? And on the next slide, I might give a hint to, well, my suggestion to that would be that it's just for the fun. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Peter, for not only a very interesting talk, but some very nice use of the dome. So, any questions? Who's throwing? You or me?
Oh, you're throwing these things.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you very much for your interesting talk. I have a question about, at one point you mentioned this different information in the classical terms, that you need less information to predict for the cause to predict effect or more. I forgot, but could you comment on that? Because, yeah, I'm not aware of that word. And, yeah, in my view, actually, information is conserved, so I would like to understand better what is meant by cause and effect.
Well, that's one thing we all want to know, right? Cause and effect is one of the biggest questions, of course, to quantify. That's work that's been that started like in the early 80s, 1984, with a guy called Jim Crutchfield working on things like Epsilon Machines. It's a very, I cannot explain it in a few words. I'll just give you the pointer. It's a thing called Epsilon Machines. With that, you can actually quantify how much information the effect, how much of the cause is stored. You can recover from the effect of something that evolves over time, and that's the CMU that I was showing to you. So you can quantify that, and you will find that you actually need more than you find back in the effect. And then if you do the same calculation again, but then using quantum information, because of the efficiency that you can store more states at the same time in the quantum system, then actually you see that the amount of information that needs to be transferred is actually less, in order to get to explain the effect in the same way you can explain the effect in the classical way. So that's the bottom line. So the way I would like to point you to this paper of Mila Gu, and the work of Jim Crutchfield. That it's pretty intricate stuff there. Yeah.
Thanks.
I was wondering about the magnet principle that you showed. How do you define the interaction such that this behavior actually happens, or what are the conditions for that?
Okay, it's actually relatively simple. It is like an Ising spin model. So what you say, you just have the magnet, little magnets, if you like, that you put on those nodes. And let's say that they are in a stable situation like this, and then you try to change this one, but because it's in a field of other magnets, it will start to interact with each other, which we can study that. There's the dynamics of that is called Glauber dynamics. We can study how that change actually propagates through the network. And the bottom line is that normally in an Ising spin, what you would do that in a very regular matrix, like you put nodes or like magnets in a matrix, and then you play around with it. But now, because you have this topological, very particular structure, which has this high conductivity, a low conductivity, and something in between, you get a very different kind of dynamics going on. And then if you measure that, so you just flip a spin, or you flip a magnet, and then you see how that flip is actually propagated through the network, then you will find that these men in the street, as I call it, are the ones that dominate the dynamics in that network.
I'm not an expert. I would like to understand, you mentioned information dissipation across the network at some point. I just want to understand if in a physical sense this would be more like diffusion of information, or if really information is somehow dissipated, like lost from the system.
So that's an excellent question. So the way we do that is we calculate a thing which is called mutual information. So it is like the equivalent of that is like a cross correlation. You just calculate how, if you change something here, how it will affect something there. And the reason why we call this dissipation is because the concentration of the information, if you like, that we call information like a change, like a flip is in change in information. The concentration of that information not only diffuses away, but at some point leaks away, because we're looking at finite space problems. We're not looking at infinite space problems. And so at some point you get that effect.
From last time when we hit somebody in the head when that realizing that's such an effect. So I want to just take up Stefano, his point. I'm trying to understand when you say cause and effect, and that there's been a transfer of information from cause to effect.
Yeah.
Can you give me an analogy or some way I can connect? Because I can't quite see how. I can't see the point. I think it's important. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, I find it difficult to explain rather than in equations. So yeah, I'm sorry for that, but so that's probably my problem. So what you can think of it like so if you have a set of bits. Let's look at a classical situation. You have a set of bits that describe the state of a system at a certain point. Then you ask yourself, how much of that structure, how much of the bits that are stored in that structure, how much of that do I find at some point later in time? So you just look at time tracing. Time tracing plays a crucial role here. Maybe I didn't say that. So then you say, okay, so in the next state, there's so much of that information is coming from here. So how much is here that was already there? So if you quantify that using these Epsilon machines, you will find that you need much more information from the past than to describe the future than you actually find in the future. That's the basic thing that comes out of that. And then the observation by Milagou, etc., is that if you would do that in a quantum situation, that additional amount of information is shrinked. And that's because it's basically a quantum efficiency that you get out of that. And that was a remarkable result, which we actually didn't believe. And then, like I said, they did these experiments in Queensland, and they validated that with a quantum computer. So that was pretty cool.
So that, just to not to continue with it because it's not my turn, but so what I'm taking from that is, in the quantum situation, that honestly looks like a production of new information, and that would require an input of energy under the Landau principle.
Exact.
That is a bit unexpected.
Yeah, exact. So the confusion here, if you look at that in terms of Landau, where you say, okay, I need some energy to remove that particular bit, because that's what you're referring to. I'm not sure if you can apply that here. I just don't know. Yeah, but that's an excellent point. Yeah. Yeah.
Anything else? Yeah, that's a long one.
I didn't want to be. I've seen this happen before.
Brilliant.
So
are the highly connected nodes less influential because they're stabilized, like in the Ising model, or because there's very few of them, like in the open window model, or is it a combination of both?
I think it's a combination of both. The way we want to look at it, not just in the static case, but also in the dynamic case, right? So the question we ask ourselves is, if we have such a network and we take out the hub, how much would that affect the emergent properties of the network itself, the thing that the network is doing, like generating new proteins or generating new information? And then if you take out the hub, well, one way to look at it is that the information of that hub is already stored in all the nodes that it's connected to. So it actually doesn't matter if you take it out, because the information is already stored. So you have to think about it like a dynamical system rather than a static system. So that's where it actually differs from these two examples that you were saying. Yeah.
To continue with the previous discussion a little bit, is it the case that in the classical case versus the quantum case, what you actually give up when you go to the quantum case is actually being able to predict a discrete solution, and you get a probabilistic solution. So basically you need less information because you can predict less.
Yeah, so that's what I asked also, Mila, and what he says is that, and now I have to quote him, this is not my work, this is his work. So what he says is basically what we do, also in the classical case, we just describe the propagation of probability functions rather than a discrete function. So in that way, it's comparable to each other. So that's the answer I got out of that.